The radio crackled once, then silence, then her voice. It came through the static and the gunfire and the specific chaos of a night that had turned against every plan ever made for it. And it was calm. Not the calm of someone removed from danger. The calm of someone who had moved through danger and come out the other side of it and found something there that most people never find. A place where fear exists but does not govern. A place where the mind works clearly because it has decided to work clearly and the decision is final. She said, Alpha element, pull back west 150 meters. Use the drainage channel on your left. Move now. Commander Reed Beckridge pressed his back against a boulder the size of a delivery truck and held the radio and listened. He was 54 years old. He had 30 years of operational experience behind him, several dozen firefights, 3 theaters of war, and the kind of judgment that only comes from having been wrong enough times to learn what right feels like when it arrives. The radio had never spoken to him like that before. Not in that voice, not with that particular quality of authority that was not rank and was not volume and was not the performing of confidence. It was something else, something he had encountered rarely in 3 decades. The sound of a person who knows exactly what they are looking at and exactly what needs to happen next and has no interest in discussing either of those things when the discussion would cost lives. She said, Commander, move your wounded first. I will still be here when you have. He stared at the radio in his hand for 1 full second. 1 second is a long time in a firefight. It is long enough to make a decision that changes the shape of everything that follows. He made his decision. He did what she said. This is not the story of that night. Not yet. This is the story of the 18 hours before it. Of a morning that began with a helicopter and a duffel bag, and a room full of experienced, serious professional men who looked at her and knew with the absolute certainty of people who have spent their lives trusting their own judgment exactly what she was and what she was capable of. They were wrong about nearly everything. The forward operating base sat at 6,000 feet in a fold of the eastern mountains in the kind of place that exists on military maps and nowhere else. The kind of place that has no permanent name, because permanence is not the point of it. It had a generator that hummed through the night like a mechanical heartbeat. 3 prefabricated structures joined by covered walkways. A medical tent on the northern side with canvas walls that moved when the wind moved. A communications array that pulled satellite signals from across the sky. And a perimeter that had been reinforced twice in the preceding week by men who understood that reinforcement was not pessimism, but preparation. The mountains rose on 3 sides like the walls of something ancient and indifferent. The 4th side opened onto the valley, and the valley stretched east toward a horizon that was never quite visible through the atmospheric haze that altitude and distance produced together. The air at 6,000 feet in late March carried a cold that was not the cold of storms. It was the cold of altitude. Persistent and thin, the kind that worked through layers and settled into joints and became part of the environment the way gravity was part of the environment. Something you moved through without acknowledging, because acknowledging it changed nothing. Soldiers learned to move through things that could not be removed. The cold was one of those things. The last helicopter of the day came in from the southwest at 1700 hours, running low along the ridgeline to minimize its exposure profile. It touched down on the landing pad and the rotor wash moved across the base like a flat hand sweeping a table pushing dust and grit in a wide circle that caught the late afternoon light and turned it briefly golden before it settled. The crew chief pushed 2 fuel cells and a pallet of medical resupply off the back ramp. Then one person stepped down, and the helicopter lifted and banked and was gone before she had crossed the landing pad. She stepped into the rotor wash and it hit her, and her hair snapped sideways and she caught it with one hand without breaking stride, without looking up, without any of the small hesitations that people who are arriving somewhere unfamiliar display when they are trying to orient themselves to a new space. She already knew where she was going. The base layout had been part of the mission package, and she had memorized it 3 days earlier when she was reviewing the intelligence on the deployment. She had also memorized something else from that package, something she had not told anyone, something she had noticed in the data that had been the reason she applied for this slot in the first place. She carried this piece of knowledge the way she carried the letter in her inside pocket. Close, quiet, accessible when needed. The duffel over her shoulder was standard issue black. The medical kit in her right hand was a hardshell pelican case, also black. She wore gray cargo pants and a navy fleece, and she moved across the landing pad the way someone moves when they have a destination and nothing to prove about getting there. Master Chief Cole Denner was standing at the edge of the landing pad with a tablet in his hand when she passed within 8 feet of him. Denner was 6'2" and 220 pounds of 12 years of operational service and cross-training with units whose names did not appear in press releases. He watched her walk past him with the assessment he applied to everything that entered his operational space. Immediate, total, without apology. He turned to the operator beside him and said what he was thinking without editorial adjustment. "She's smaller than her bag." The operator beside him started to respond, looked at Denner's expression and reconsidered. Denner was not technically wrong about the size. She was 5'4" on her best morning, maybe 118 pounds in full gear. She had dark brown hair pulled back with the functional practicality of someone who solved problems rather than managed appearances, and a face that was young enough that the base's outer sentry had checked her contractor identification twice before waving her through. Her eyes were dark and moved quickly, and with a quality that Denner, had he been paying a different kind of attention, might have recognized as systematic. The eyes of someone cataloging rather than observing, taking in information with a purpose that was not casual. But Denner was not paying that kind of attention. He had made his assessment, and his assessment was complete, and he was already moving on to the next thing, which was the fuel cell inventory and the mission timeline and the 17 other items on his internal checklist that required attention before 2100. Her name was Sarah Dunley. She was listed in the operational roster as a Navy corpsman and civilian medical contractor, assigned to the unit at the specific request of Naval Special Warfare Command to fill a slot that had opened unexpectedly 4 days earlier, when the original corpsman, Lieutenant Morrow, developed acute appendicitis and was evacuated to a surgical facility in Germany. Her credentials were clean: Johns Hopkins Medical School, trauma certification, 2 prior deployments in non-kinetic support roles, medical record of service, 53 confirmed field interventions. All 53 had survived. That last number was the one that caught Commander Beckridge's attention when he reviewed her file that morning. He had read it once and then read it again, not because he doubted the number, because 53 out of 53 in field conditions was the kind of statistic that raised a question about what kind of person produced it. Luck gives you 40 out of 53. Skill gives you 48. 53 out of 53 is something else, something that does not have a clean word for it in the vocabulary that operational commanders typically use. He found her in the medical tent 40 minutes after the helicopter landed. She had already organized the supply crates by medication category and trauma classification and was cross-referencing the existing inventory against the projected mission timeline on a notepad. She worked with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had done this before and knew what she was doing and did not need to perform the knowing for anyone watching. She looked up when he came in, not startled, not performing attentiveness, just redirected. "Commander Beckridge, you reviewed the mission brief." "Yes, sir." "Questions?" She tilted her head slightly, the head tilt of someone selecting from a longer list. "The projected casualty estimate uses pre-2021 baseline data for this region. Given current atmospheric conditions and the altitude differential between the insertion point and the target valley, I would adjust that figure upward by approximately 20%. He looked at her. I raise it only because it affects supply positioning, she continued. If we lose access to the primary medical station in the first hour, which the terrain profile makes plausible, I would want pre-staged kits at 3 secondary locations. I can set those up this evening. Beckridge considered her for a moment. He had expected questions about the communication channels, a request for the casualty extraction plan, standard contractor concerns that were legitimate but routine. He had not expected her to have already completed a risk analysis on the casualty projections. Set up whatever you need, he said. He walked out of the tent and stood in the cold air for a moment before continuing on. He made a note, not a written one, the internal kind, stored in the place where the things that might matter later are kept until they are needed. Denner made his assessment known 3 times before dinner. The first time was at the equipment check when he noted aloud that the medical kit she had requested access to from the forward cache was more comprehensive than any field kit he had seen outside of an actual trauma center. The second time was during the afternoon briefing when she sat in the back row and said nothing for 40 minutes, but watched the topographic overlay projected on the wall with an attention that Denner noticed without fully processing. The way you notice a thing at the edge of vision without turning to look at it directly. The third time was at dinner, when he sat across from 3 other operators and stated with the flat certainty of a man reading weather conditions that she was going to be a liability in the field. He said it without cruelty. In Denner's world, liability was the most critical word in the working vocabulary. Liability was the variable that got people killed. Liability was what you identified and removed from an operational equation before the equation went live. He was protecting his element. He would have said so, and he would have meant it, and he would not have been entirely wrong to frame it that way. What he could not know was that she had heard him. She sat on the other side of that canvas divider and finished her meal and said nothing. Her father had taught her this. Deflection is economy. Hold your words for the moments that require them. Everything before that is noise, and engaging noise is how you exhaust the things you need for the work. She had been practicing this economy for 16 years. She was very good at it. Chief Petty Officer Vance Kellam found her at the perimeter wire as the afternoon became evening. He was 53 years old, built in the way that men who have been doing serious physical work for 3 decades are built dense and settled with a stillness about him that was different in quality from the stillness of younger men. The stillness of someone who has processed a large number of difficult things and arrived at the far side of the processing, carrying all of them and still moving at the same pace. He had said almost nothing since she arrived. He had watched her from across rooms with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was not open either. The expression of a man in the process of confirming a suspicion. He found her standing at the eastern edge of the base looking out over the valley as the shadow filled it from the bottom up, the way shadow always fills valleys, like water rising. He stood beside her and looked at the same valley for a long moment before he spoke. Your father's name was Nolan Dunley. She was still for 1 beat, 2 beats, a very deliberate stillness. Yes, she said. SEAL Team 3 Desert Storm, Somalia. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Retired 2012. She turned to look at him then. I trained at Coronado with him in 1995, Kellam said. I was 24 years old, and I had arrived at that installation with the absolute certainty of a young man who has been told he is excellent and has not yet encountered anyone who can demonstrate exactly what excellent actually looks like. A pause. The kind of pause that holds weight. Nolan spent 45 minutes adjusting that certainty. He was polite about it. That almost made it worse. He never mentioned you, she said. He mentioned very few people by name. That was Nolan. Kellam looked back at the valley. He mentioned you, though. Not directly and not often. But once when I ran into him at Coronado about 4 years before he died, he said his daughter had something he called the eye. He said it was the rarest thing he had encountered in 40 years of looking, and that he was spending considerable effort helping it become something that understood its own weight. She said nothing. He passed in 2019, she said after a moment. March 14th, cerebral hemorrhage. He was 57 years old and had come through Desert Storm and Somalia and 3 tours. And he died in a hospital in San Diego, 3 days after a stroke that arrived without announcement. She said this without bitterness and without the softening that people use when they are performing grief rather than carrying it. It was a recitation of facts that she had lived with long enough that they had settled into something she could say directly. Kellam nodded. I'm sorry. Thank you. The valley was dark now. The first stars were appearing above the eastern ridge, and the generator behind them cycled, and the lights in the main structure flickered and held. The way you looked at that topographic overlay this afternoon, Kellam said quietly. The way your eyes moved to the ridge lines and not the valley floor when you were listening to the Overwatch discussion. He paused. That was Nolan. She did not respond to that. I'm not asking you anything, he said. I want to be clear about that. I am not asking. I am saying what I observed, and I am saying that I understand what it means. And whatever you came here prepared to do, you will not be doing it with everyone on this base unaware of what they have. He looked at her. Someone should know. Someone is me, and now you know that I know. He walked back toward the base without waiting for a response. She stood at the wire for a long time after that. The stars multiplied above the eastern ridge, and the cold settled deeper, and she stood with it and let it settle. There is something you need to know about Nolan Dunley before the story goes any further. He was not a famous man. His name appears in no published account of any operation he participated in across 30 years of service. There are no documentaries, no books with his photograph, no interviews given to journalists or historians or the producers of cable television programs about special operations. In the world where his reputation existed, it existed the way the most important things exist in that world. Passed between men in conversation in the specific and unrecorded way that matters most. He joined the Navy at 18. He moved through basic underwater demolition and SEAL training with a particular combination of physical endurance and mental economy that the instructors at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado recognized and could not fully account for. He was not the strongest candidate in his class, not the fastest. He was the one who, when conditions became genuinely unbearable, seemed to subtract himself from the unbearable and continue functioning from somewhere else, somewhere quieter and more internal, a place that the training was designed to find and that not everyone had. He became a SEAL. Then he became very good at it. Then he became something rarer than that, which is a man who understands not only how to do the work, but why it is worth doing, and the significant distance between those two understandings. Desert Storm in 1991. Somalia in 1993. The Battle of Mogadishu in October of that year, a battle that became a word that carries specific meaning in military history. 3 tours in Afghanistan across the decade that followed the towers. Long-range Overwatch work that never appeared in any after-action report in any form that could be recovered through a Freedom of Information request. He became, in the language of his world, a ghost. Not because he sought that designation, but because it was accurate. He retired in 2012. He settled in San Diego. He ran every morning at 5:30 and maintained his equipment and taught when asked at a private facility whose name does not appear in this account for reasons that should be self-evident. And when his daughter was 10 years old, he put a rifle in her hands, not because he wanted her to become what he was. He was very specific with himself about that from the beginning. And she understood it even at 10 in the way that children of serious people understand the texture of what is being asked of them. He put the rifle in her hands because he believed that a person who understood how a weapon worked truly understood it from the physics of the projectile through the mathematics of the environment to the psychology of the decision was a person who understood something foundational about force and consequence and the weight of a choice. He taught her for years. Every weekend they could manage. Some mornings in summer, when there was no school and the light came early, and they could be at the range before the heat arrived. Distance, wind, breath, trigger discipline, the mathematics of ballistics, the patience of waiting without losing focus, the difference between a shot that is possible and a shot that is right. When she was 16, she put a round on a target at 900 meters in a crosswind, and he looked at the result through his spotting scope for a long moment and said, "Adjust your follow-through." She adjusted it. He said nothing more. She understood that to be the highest compliment he knew how to give. She went to Johns Hopkins. He supported this with the same quiet directness he brought to everything. Her hands were for healing. He believed this without reservation, and the fact that he had also given them another capability was something he held carefully. The way you hold something precious and also complicated. In March of 2018, he sat down and wrote a letter. He did not tell her he had written it. He put it in an envelope and placed it where she would find it when the time came. He knew about his heart by then. The doctors had given him numbers and he had understood what the numbers meant. And he was not afraid of what they implied. But he was practical about it. And practical action meant saying the things he wanted to say before saying them became impossible. He died on March 14th, 2019, in a hospital room in San Diego. He was 57 years old. She was 21. She was in her second year at Johns Hopkins. The call came at 6 in the morning, and she sat in her dormitory room for 1 hour and felt the specific rearrangement of the interior world that happens when the person who built the interior world is gone. The walls moved, the floor moved. Everything she had organized her understanding of herself around had to be reorganized. Then she stood up. She went to class. She did the next thing and the thing after that because that was what he had taught her. She found the letter with his things 2 weeks later when she went home for the days after the funeral. She opened it sitting in her childhood bedroom in Denton, Texas, with the winter light coming through the window. She read it once straight through without stopping. Then she folded it and put it in her inside pocket. She had carried it there every day since. She made a promise to her mother in the kitchen of that house in Denton. Her mother had watched Nolan leave for 30 years, had watched him walk out the door and come back and walk out again, and come back carrying things he would never fully name. Her mother had asked her to leave the weapons side of his work behind when he was gone. Not everything, just the part that had nothing to do with healing. She had promised. She had meant it completely. She was thinking about all of this when she came back inside the wire and walked to the medical tent and spent an hour setting up her secondary trauma caches. She moved her primary equipment to 3 positions she had identified as protected and accessible from multiple directions. She did this after dark alone without telling anyone. Nobody saw her do it. She did it anyway. The next morning, 4 hours before the mission was scheduled to begin, she found Reed Westcott. He was 23 years old and carried the energy that young operators carry before the first time something genuinely tries to kill them. The coiled readiness of a body that has been trained to its capacity and not yet presented with the invoice for that training. He was working through equipment checks on the south side of the main structure, moving well, looking well, presenting as exactly what his morning medical check had reported him to be, mission ready. She watched him for 90 seconds. She watched the specific way he blinked, the deliberateness of it, the fraction of additional effort that blinking was requiring, which was not a thing most people would notice, and which she noticed because noticing was what she had been doing in one form or another since she could remember. She watched his hands on the equipment. The grip was right, but the assurance was slightly off. A quarter-second delay in the transitions between items that should not have been there. She watched the way he tilted his head when another operator spoke to him from his left side. Slightly too late, a small lag in the orienting reflex. She walked over. Westcott. He looked up with the easy attention of someone who has nothing to hide. Hold still a moment. He held still. She put 2 fingers to his wrist and counted. She looked at his pupils in the varying light. She asked him 3 questions in a specific sequence and listened not only to the answers, but to the timing of them. You are in the early stage of exertional heat illness, she said. Started probably yesterday afternoon based on the presentation. Core temperature is elevated. Heart rate is slightly irregular. You need fluids and rest, and you need to be moved off the heavy equipment rotation for the next 3 hours. He began the objection she had already prepared for. I feel fine. Your reaction time is running about 12% slow, she said, without elevation in her voice. You have not noticed it because 12% is inside the range that feels normal when you are the one experiencing it. Tonight it will matter. If this progresses to the next stage in the field, you become a liability to your element and a danger to yourself and to the people around you. A pause. The weight of what she had not said sitting in the space between them. Commander Beckridge is going to want to know about this. Westcott looked at her for a moment, recalibrating. Then he sat down. She had the IV kit open in 20 seconds. Beckridge came over during the process and watched without speaking. When she finished and stood up, she gave the assessment concisely. Full capacity in 3 hours with proper fluid replacement. Limited duty until 1400. Beckridge nodded once. He walked away. Denner had been watching from 10 feet away. He said nothing. But he shifted his position to one slightly closer to where she was working. And he spent the next 30 minutes paying a different kind of attention than he had been paying before. The mission briefing ran at 1300 hours in the largest of the prefabricated structures. It was standing room. Beckridge ran it with the economy of a man who understood that preparation and execution were the same process at different points in time, and every word he said had a function and performed it. Sarah stood at the back of the room. She had a notebook and a mechanical pencil, and she listened with the completeness of attention that makes a person effectively invisible in a crowd. Because people who are watching everything are usually seen by no one. The topographic overlay was projected on the wall. Eastern Valley, 8 kilometers from current position. Known weapons cache at the structure that satellite imagery confirmed was occupied. Ingress primary through the valley floor. Secondary along the northern ridge. One dedicated sniper asset. Staff Sergeant Aldrich with a proven long-range record. One medical element. She studied the overlay. 40 minutes in the discussion moved to viable overwatch positions on the secondary ridge route. Beckridge indicated 2 positions on the map. She looked at both of them, and looked at the terrain, and looked at the valley floor below them. And without looking up from her notebook, she said, the outcropping at grid reference 477 creates a firing solution that puts your own element inside the risk quarter if there is any lateral spread. The rock shelf at 479 30 meters further north eliminates that problem and gives a cleaner line to the target structure. The room was quiet. Beckridge looked at the overlay. He looked at both positions. He looked at her. Where did you get that? I read the contours, she said. He studied the map for 5 more seconds. Then he redirected the briefing to the alternative position. Denner was standing 6 feet to her left. She did not look at him, but she was aware of the adjustment in the quality of his attention. The subtle physical shift of a man who has been holding a conclusion and has just encountered a fact that the conclusion cannot fully accommodate. She wrote something in her notebook and said nothing else. The hours before a mission have a specific texture. The base changed through the afternoon. Movement becoming more deliberate, more economical. The velocity of conversation dropping as men moved inward to the preparation that serious people do before serious things. Weapons were cleaned with the focus of men who had learned that this task could not be left to the hour before contact. Equipment was checked against lists and then checked again. She worked through her medical preparations with the same focused attention she brought to everything. Then she sat alone on a crate behind the medical tent as the afternoon light turned amber and then gray. She did not take the letter out. She pressed her palm flat against her chest and felt it there. The familiar slight stiffness of the folded paper through the fabric of her jacket. It had been with her for 5 years, against her ribs where the heartbeat was, where the things you carry closest live. Her father had understood something about time that most people understand in theory, but rarely apply in practice. He had understood that the moments which require the most important things to be said do not wait for convenient pauses in the schedule. They arrive unannounced and at high speed and without adequate warning. And the things that need saying need to have been said already in advance when there was still time to say them carefully. He had said his things in advance. She had read them enough times that they lived inside her now, part of the architecture of how she thought about herself. No longer instructions from outside, but something integrated, something that had become less like a letter and more like bone. She pressed her palm against her chest. Outside the tent, the temperature dropped with the sun. The mountains turned black against a sky that held the last of the light longer than the land below it. The generator hummed. The bass settled into the particular quiet that comes before the particular noise that follows it. 480 men prepared for what was coming. She prepared for what she knew they had not accounted for. They inserted a 2100 hours. 3 helicopters lights off running low through the mountain corridors where the rock walls rose close enough on either side that the rotor wash bounced back and buffeted the airframes with the turbulence of their own making. The pilots flew by instruments and by the particular instinct that helicopter pilots develop in mountain terrain, which is not quite trust and not quite calculation, but something that lives between the two and keeps them alive in the space where either one alone would not. Sarah sat in the second aircraft with the medical element. She sat with her back against the vibrating fuselage wall and her trauma kit between her knees and watched the dark mountains move past the open door. Rock faces and ridgelines appearing as deeper blackness against the black sky visible for a moment, then gone, then replaced by the next. She thought about nothing in particular. This was something her father had taught her. Not the absence of thought, which is impossible for a mind that works the way hers works, but the discipline of not directing thought toward what is coming. Of letting the mind rest in the space between preparation and execution, because preparation was finished and execution had not begun. And the space between them was the last opportunity the nervous system would have to operate at baseline before baseline became unavailable. It had taken years to develop correctly. She had learned it the way she had learned everything from him, through repetition and correction, and the slow accumulation of a capability that felt unnatural at first, and eventually felt like the only natural thing. The valley floor was 3 kilometers of open ground, and then a rise of terrain that funneled toward the target location. The intelligence package had rated the area low threat. Recent drone coverage had shown nothing unusual. The cache was supposed to be lightly defended. She had been in enough operational context to understand the gap between supposed to be and is. She did not distrust the assessment. She simply knew that assessments were made from data, and that data was always incomplete. And the incompleteness was reliably where the trouble lived. She kept this to herself. It was not her job to revise the mission parameters. It was her job to be fully ready for what the mission parameters might not have accounted for. They landed 2 kilometers from the objective. The helicopters dropped them and were gone before the dust settled, climbing hard and banking west and disappearing into the mountain corridors they had come through. The silence they left behind was total and immediate. The kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of listening. The mountains listening, the valley listening. Everything suspended in the dark, waiting for something to break the suspension. The formation moved to approach. 480 men arranged in elements that moved across the terrain with the rehearsed coordination of a single organism with many parts. She moved with the medical element center formation standard position. She moved with the efficiency of someone who understood that every step before contact was an investment in what came after. Her boots found ground without testing it. Her weight distributed across each step in the way that produces movement without announcement. Vance Kellum was 3 positions forward and to her left. Once in the first kilometer, he turned and found her in the dark with the accuracy of someone whose spatial awareness had been wired into his nervous system over decades. He looked at her for 1 second and looked forward again. That single look contained everything it needed to contain. I know you are here. I know what you are. Proceed. She scanned the ridgelines as she walked. She did this the way you do the things that have been trained into you early enough, without conscious decision, as naturally as breathing, extracting information from the terrain the way a reader extracts meaning from a page. At 3.5 kilometers, she noticed something, a variance in the optical texture of a boulder cluster on the eastern ridge at roughly 2 o'clock from her position. Minor, easily explained by natural shadow variation at this altitude and angle. Easily dismissed. She noted it and continued. 100 meters further, a different position, same quality of variance. Irregularity within the irregularity. A pattern in the randomness. The kind of thing that does not announce itself but accumulates. The kind of thing that most people would process as background noise and discard. She did not discard it. She registered it the way she registered everything her training had given her eyes to see, without alarm, without announcement, filed as information awaiting context. At 3 kilometers from the objective, the night broke open. The first RPG came from the eastern ridge, and the concussion rolled down the valley like a physical thing. A wave of pressure that you felt in your chest before you heard it as sound. It displaced the air and the silence, and every assumption that had been made about this mission in a single detonation that lit the ridgeline orange for 1/2 second, and then plunged it back into darkness. Before the sound finished traveling, both ridges were alive with fire. It was coordinated, simultaneous. The kind of initiation that required planning and positioning and communication at a level far above opportunistic ambush. The eastern ridge opened up with interlocking fields of fire that covered the valley floor in overlapping arcs. The western ridge added to it from the other direction. The valley that had looked navigable on every drone image and satellite pass for the past 2 weeks became something else entirely in the space of 90 seconds. Somebody had known they were coming. Somebody had known the route and the timing and the formation. The intelligence package had not been incomplete. It had been compromised. None of that mattered in the first 90 seconds. What mattered in the first 90 seconds was surviving them. The formation dispersed into cover with the practiced response of men who have trained for this moment until the training becomes faster than thought. Every operator moved without waiting for commands, finding terrain, returning fire. Establishing positions in the choreography of immediate action that is drilled until it lives in the muscles rather than the mind. Sarah hit the ground and was moving before the second RPG landed. Moving left toward a rock outcropping she had noted during the approach 12 meters from her position. It offered elevation and partial cover from the eastern ridge. She reached it in 6 seconds. She was already opening her trauma kit. The first casualty found her 11 seconds later. Shrapnel wound right arm. An operator named Paulson, who had taken fragments from the first RPG and was moving under his own power, but losing blood from 3 separate lacerations. She packed and wrapped in 2 minutes. Clean, efficient. The work of hands that had done this 53 times before and understood that speed and precision were not competing values, but the same value expressed differently. The second casualty was Reed Westcott. He came in supported by another operator. His right leg failing beneath him, his face carrying the specific expression of a man whose body has been damaged in a way he has not yet fully processed. He was conscious. He was trying to speak. The words were not arriving in the order he intended. She assessed in 4 seconds. Femoral artery, partial laceration, blood pressure in the right leg already compromised. The volume of blood on his pants told her how much time she had, and the answer was less than most people would want to hear. The cat tourniquet went on high and tight without ceremony, combat gauze packed directly into the wound, with the pressure that feels wrong to the untrained hand, and is absolutely correct. She talked to him while she worked, not the soothing noise of bedside manner, but specific clinical information delivered in a steady voice, because she had learned that clarity worked better than comfort when men were operating at the edge of fear. Tourniquet is on. Pressure is building. You are going to feel it. That is correct. Look at my face, not at the wound. He looked at her face. Good. Keep looking at my face. The third casualty came in from her left, and she moved before the operator helping him had finished reaching her. Tension and pneumothorax. The signs were unmistakable. Tracheal deviation. Absent breath sounds on the left. Respiratory distress climbing toward crisis in the specific accelerating pattern that meant minutes rather than hours. 14-gauge needle. Second intercostal space. Mid-clavicular line. Inserted with the committed pressure. The procedure required because a hesitant needle decompression was a failed one. The rush of air was the sound of a correct diagnosis confirmed. The sound of a chest cavity releasing the pressure that was collapsing a lung. The sound of someone continuing to live. She moved. The fire from the eastern ridge was coordinated and effective. 2 heavy machine gun positions with overlapping fields of fire that covered the natural escape routes and pinned 3 elements of operators behind terrain features that offered protection from direct fire, but no avenue of movement. The positions were protected by natural rock overhang from direct fire below. From the valley floor, there was no good angle to reach them. There was no good answer to them. She was checking a 4th casualty when she heard Beckridge on the radio. Does anyone have eyes on the eastern emplacements? I need options. She was aware of Staff Sergeant Aldrich. His right shoulder had been hit by a ricochet in the first minutes of contact. Another operator had stabilized the wound, but the shoulder was gone as a functional platform, and the M24 sniper rifle that was Aldrich's entire purpose in this formation was sitting in his kit 20 meters away doing nothing. She was aware of the machine gun positions. She had been aware of them since the fire started, tracking them the way she tracked everything, with the part of her attention that ran parallel to the medical work and never fully stopped. She knew their positions. She knew their firing cycles. She knew the angles. She finished with the 4th casualty. She looked at the eastern ridge. She looked at Kellum, who was behind a rock 17 meters to her left. Kellum was looking at her with the expression of a man who has done the same calculation she is doing and is prepared to let her decide. She put her trauma kit down. She picked it up again. She put it down. Above her, the machine gun position on the eastern ridge opened up on the drainage channel, where 40 operators were pinned with no cover to their right. The sound of it was not abstract, not tactical. It was immediate and physical, and it contained the specific arithmetic of how much longer those 40 men could survive in that position under that fire. She reached into her inside pocket. She took the letter out. She held it against her palm for 3 full seconds. She felt the weight of the paper, the familiar slight stiffness of it, the 5 years of carrying it against her heart, against the heartbeat, against the ribs. Her father had written words in that letter that she knew by memory. He had written about a promise and the thing a promise protects. He had written that there would come a moment when the promise and the right thing would not be the same thing. He had written that he trusted her to know the difference. She knew the difference. She put the letter back. She looked at Kellum. Where is the M24? He had been waiting for precisely this question. Aldrich's kit, left side pocket. She moved. The M24 was exactly where Kellum had said it would be. She pulled it clear, and the weight of it settled into her hands, and 16 years compressed into a single moment. Not a memory, not a retrieval of stored information, something that lived below memory, below conscious recall, in the place where things that have been practiced 10,000 times live permanently. The way your hands know the handle of your own front door in total darkness. Before the light, before the thought, she checked the chamber, round-seated, magazine secure, safety engaged. She ran her right thumb along the stock and found the scope and confirmed it was the Schmidt and Bender 3 to 12 that Aldrich used. Not her preferred configuration, but within the range of adaptable, and she was already mapping the adjustments she would need before she had consciously decided to make them. Kellum moved to her left without being directed. He understood positioning the way people understand their native language, not as a set of acquired rules, but as a physical grammar absorbed so early it feels like instinct. He placed himself 12 meters to her left and slightly forward, which gave him sight lines to the north slope and put him in position to read wind. She was climbing before the decision had finished forming. The north slope rose at approximately 35 degrees where she needed to go, fractured shale and limestone, loose in places, stable in others. The darkness that made everything harder was also the darkness that made movement possible. She moved low and without sound, which is not a natural human behavior, but a learned one. The product of years of practice in moving across surfaces without announcing the movement. Distributing weight in the specific way that does not transfer vibration into sound. Her father had spent hundreds of hours on this with her, on hillsides in Texas, on rock faces in New Mexico, in the dark, always in the dark, because the dark was where it mattered. The fire from the eastern ridge was continuous and to her right. She moved through it the way you move through weather that cannot be avoided. Present to it, not stopping for it. 3 rounds struck rock within 15 meters of her position. She adjusted her route by 4 meters and kept climbing. Callum's voice in her earpiece, a breath above silence. Wind east-northeast 12 miles per hour consistent. Temperature 41 degrees. Altitude differential to target position approximately 60 meters. Filed, noted, applied. She climbed. The machine gun position on the eastern ridge was at 780 meters horizontal distance and 60 meters above the valley floor. She was reaching the altitude of the position from an angular line that the operators below could not reach, because the overhang that protected the position from direct fire beneath it provided no protection from this angle. She had understood this geometry since the briefing, since the moment her eyes had moved to the ridge lines, and her mind had done what her mind does. Built the 3-dimensional model, identified the vulnerability, filed it for later. Later was now. She found a rock shelf that jutted from the slope at the height she needed. She went flat. The cold of the rock came through her jacket and pants and settled against her body, and she registered it as information and set it aside. She extended the bipod. She settled the rifle into her shoulder, and it found the correct position without negotiation, without the small adjustments of someone working with an unfamiliar platform. She looked through the scope and acquired the terrain. The machine gun emplacement was there. 2 men, one on the gun, one managing the ammunition feed and watching their left flank. They knew their work. The natural rock overhang above them was augmented with sandbags. They had a commanding view of the valley floor. They were covering the natural routes that the operators below were trying to use, and they were doing it effectively. And every second they continued doing it was a second measured in the lives of the men pinned beneath them. 780 meters, she breathed. Her father had taught her when she was 10 years old, standing in a field in Texas in the early morning, that shooting a distance was not an act of force. It was an act of mathematics and biology, and the specific discipline of making your body an instrument of precision for the duration of a moment so brief that most people could not find it. He had said it took 5 years to learn to do it adequately, and 20 years to learn to do it well. And the difference between adequately and well was the difference between chance and intention. He had started teaching her at 10. She was 26 now. She mapped the wind. East-northeast 12 miles per hour, consistent, confirmed, from 2 positions. At 780 meters, a 12-mile-per-hour crosswind produced a lateral drift of approximately 14 inches at the bullet weight she was working with. She adjusted the windage turret. She addressed elevation for the altitude differential and the temperature drop and the slight Coriolis effect that was minor at this range and not ignorable. She set her breathing. 4 seconds in, hold, 8 seconds out. The rhythm that brought the heart rate down from operational tempo toward the low 60s, which was where precision lived. She had been doing this since she was 12 years old. It was as automatic now as any of the other things her body had learned to do without asking permission. She found her natural point of aim, adjusted 2 inches right to keep the position stable, because a shooting position that requires active muscular effort to maintain introduces error at the moment of firing. She placed the reticle on the first target. She waited for her heartbeat, found it in her chest, her wrist, her throat, found the pause between contractions, the quarter second of stillness when the body's between beats and the tremor that the heart produces is at its minimum. That was the window. She squeezed. The rifle moved back into her shoulder with the controlled recoil of a platform she had shot 1,000 times, and she held through it and brought the scope back down to the target. The shot had gone right. 8 inches right. She held still. She breathed. She did not allow the miss to become anything other than data. Data about the wind. Data about the conditions. Data that required a correction, not a reaction. She recalculated. The wind had a gust component she had not fully weighted, a variance within the base wind that was irregular rather than constant. She watched the thermals in the scope, the way the heat from the rock face bent the air in a pattern that had a cycle. She timed it across 3 repetitions, confirmed approximately 8 seconds between gusts. She moved the windage 4 clicks left, found her breathing again, found the heart rate, found the pause between beats, waited for the gust to pass through its cycle to its minimum, the 2-second window of relative stillness at the base of the variance. She placed the reticle. She squeezed. The machine gun position went silent. Kellam's voice in her earpiece, quiet and without inflection. Target down, gun is clear. She was already repositioning. The second emplacement was 140 meters south along the eastern ridge. Different angle, different elevation. She moved 30 meters along the slope to find the sight line she needed. Smooth and low, because hurrying on a slope in the dark with a rifle is how you lose the platform and the shot, and possibly everything else. She settled, acquired. 920 meters across 2 ridgelines of thermals, and a wind shear at the midpoint that she identified by watching the dry grass on the valley floor below for 40 seconds. Reading the wind the way her father had taught her to read it. Not from instruments, from the world itself. 1 round. The position went down on the first shot. She moved again. It took 37 minutes. 6 separate firing positions. The emplacements came down one by one, the heaviest first, then the support positions, then 2 light machine gun nests on the western ridge that had been less effective, but were still blocking the retreat corridors that would be needed when the extraction began. She moved between positions in the dark with the precision of someone executing a plan she had drawn in her head before the first shot was fired. She fired when the conditions were correct, and only then. And every shot after the first was a first-round engagement. Below her in the valley, the picture changed as she worked. The trapped elements began to move as the fire covering their positions was removed. She heard Beckridge redirecting elements through the corridors she was opening, and she listened with one part of her attention while the other part worked the problem. Because she had been doing 2 things at once for long enough that the division felt natural. She did not think about what she was doing in the sense of deliberate reflection. She was past deliberation. Deliberation had happened at the base of the slope in the 2 seconds before she reached for the rifle. It had produced a decision, and the decision had been made. And what remained was execution. And execution did not require deliberation. It required the 3 things her father had spent 6 years installing in her: focus, patience, and the commitment to follow through past the difficult part, which is always the middle, and which is always where people stop. She did not stop in the middle. When the last position went down, she held her scope on the ridgeline for 90 seconds and swept it systematically, confirming, verifying, because thoroughness was not optional when the cost of incompleteness was measured in lives. Then she keyed her radio. Commander Beckridge, eastern and western ridge emplacements are neutralized. Valley corridors are open. Recommend extraction via primary route. A pause. Then Beckridge's voice, carrying the specific quality of a commanding officer, processing information that does not fit the model he has been operating from. Copy that, Doc. What is your position or so? North slope approximately 80 meters above the valley floor. I'm coming down. A longer pause. Come down slowly, he said. She descended with the rifle slung across her back and came off the rock onto the valley floor. And Kellam was there, and Beckridge was 3 meters behind Kellam, and behind Beckridge was a loose gathering of operators who had emerged from the terrain as the fire ended and who were looking at her in one way or another. She did not look back at them. She carried the rifle to Aldrich's kit and secured it and opened her trauma kit and turned to the nearest casualty. Who else needs attention? There is a particular quality to silence that follows a moment that experienced people do not know how to process. It is not the silence of confusion. The men in that valley understood the sequence of events in the technical sense of understanding. The data had been recorded. The shots had been fired. The positions had gone down. She had come off the slope with the rifle and secured it and gone back to the medical work without pause or performance, or any apparent expectation that the preceding 37 minutes required acknowledgement. The silence was the silence of recalibration, of a working model encountering a fact that it cannot accommodate without revision. Denner stood at the edge of this silence for 4 full minutes. Then he walked to where she was working on a staff sergeant named Dow. A ricochet wound in the calf, manageable, needing proper attention. He stood there and watched her work and said nothing for 2 minutes. His expression was the expression of a man doing an honest accounting. Then he said, "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" She did not look up from the wound. "My father taught me." "Who was your father?" She glanced at him briefly. Back to the wound. "A Navy man." Denner looked at Kellam, who was standing 6 feet away with the equanimity of a man who has been holding information patiently and is prepared to continue holding it for as long as necessary. Beckridge came to stand beside Denner. He had the look of a commanding officer doing what commanding officers train themselves to do after unexpected events, which is to absorb the new information without allowing it to destabilize the function of command. "Dunley," he said. She looked up. "When you are finished." 3 minutes, sir." He waited. She finished with Dow and stood and turned to face Beckridge. And he met her eyes differently than he had met them the day before. 477 men who should not have seen sunrise saw it because of what she did that night. And she went back to the work because the work was what was next. And the next thing was always enough. The intelligence package on Elias Graf arrived at 1300 hours on the second day, delivered by satellite uplink, and Beckridge read it twice before he called the senior element leaders together. It was not a long document. The important things rarely are. Graf had been born in 1973 in Knoxville, Tennessee. He had enlisted in the Army at 18 and moved through the selection process that identifies a particular kind of person and routes them toward a particular kind of work. He passed a Delta Force assessment with marks that his evaluators described in language they did not use often. He was recruited by the CIA's Special Activities Division in his early 30s, the branch that handled operations in the space between official and unofficial. The work that governments require and do not name. He was good at it. By every account, he was very good at it. His file described a man of unusual tactical intelligence and the specific kind of moral seriousness that distinguished operators who understood the weight of what they were doing from operators who had learned not to think about it. Graf had never learned not to think about it. His file noted this as an asset in the early years and a complicating factor in the later ones. In 2012, he led a four-person team into Syria on a mission designated Cardinal. The team achieved its objective. On extraction, their position was compromised. They called for support. A helicopter was dispatched. Then, 40 minutes before arrival, it was redirected. The official reason was atmospheric conditions. The atmospheric record from two independent monitoring stations in the region that night showed nothing unusual. 3 of the 4 men on Graf's team died in the hours that followed. Graf was taken. He spent 18 months in conditions that the human body was not designed to survive. Then he was out through a series of events that the document described with the specific vagueness of things that are known and cannot be fully written. He was declared killed in action in December of 2012. He was not dead. He had been alive and building something for 12 years. And what he had built was currently positioned in the mountains around this base with resources and operational planning. That was not the work of grief or madness. It was the work of a man who had spent a decade thinking clearly about a specific problem. How to make certain people answer for certain decisions. Beckridge put the document down. He is not an ideologue, Beckridge said. He does not want to destroy anything in an abstract sense. He has a specific objective, which is to force into the light a set of decisions that were made in darkness and have never been accounted for. He paused. That does not make what he has done acceptable. It makes him more dangerous than someone with an abstract purpose. Because a man with a specific rational objective plans differently than a man who is simply angry. The room absorbed this. He will try again tonight. No one asked how he knew. The logic was self-evident. A man who had built something for 12 years did not abandon it after one failed attempt. Sarah sat at the edge of the room and said nothing. She had read the document over Beckridge's shoulder when he first opened it, which he had done without asking permission, and which he had not objected to. She had read it once, and it had settled into her with the particular weight of information that rearranges the way you understand the situation you are inside of. She thought about a man in a valley in Syria in 2012 calling for help that was coming and then was not coming. She thought about the window between the call and the silence, the window where everything changed. She thought about what a person carries out of 18 months of captivity, what it does to the structure of how a person relates to the world, to institutions, to the concept of being on a side. She thought about the specific texture of a betrayal that comes from your own people and the way that particular kind of betrayal works on a person over years. Slowly. The way water works on stone. Not breaking it all at once, but changing its shape permanently through persistence. She did not say any of this. She went back to the medical tent. She spent 4 hours in preparation. She restocked the forward trauma kits. She repositioned her secondary caches to locations that accounted for the likely attack vectors of a second assault from a man who had studied his first failure and would not repeat it. She reviewed every casualty from the previous night with the attention of a physician who knows that field stabilization is not the same as resolution, and that the clock on several of these conditions had not stopped ticking simply because the immediate crisis had passed. Then she ate a full meal, methodically, because her father had been relentless about nutrition and sleep as operational factors rather than luxuries. He had said that the body does not care about your intentions. It cares about what you give it. And what you give it determines what it can give you when you need it most. He had been right about this, as he had been right about most things. She slept for 90 minutes, the compressed and genuine rest of someone whose nervous system has learned to use every available window. Not the half sleep of anxiety, real sleep. The kind that restores because the body trusts that the mind has done the preparation and the preparation is sufficient. She went back to the medical tent and checked her preparations again. Calum found her there at 1700 hours. He came in without announcement and stood at the entrance, and they looked at each other with the ease of two people who have been through enough in a short time that context no longer requires establishment. Tonight is going to be harder, he said. I know. Last night you had terrain and darkness and the advantage of no one knowing what you could do. Tonight Graf knows. He looked at her steadily. He will plan for what he learned. She nodded. How are your hands? She looked at her hands, turned them over. A small blister on the pad of her right index finger from the previous night. A minor thing she noted as data about her condition. Fine, she said. He was quiet in the way that Vance Kellum was quiet when he had been holding something and had decided to say it. Your father sent me an email, he said. January 2019, 2 months before he died. She was still. He wrote to tell me about something you were doing, something he was proud of. He was not a man who wrote emails as a general practice, so I understood that he was writing because it mattered to him to put it somewhere. Kellum looked at the tent wall, as if reading something written on it that only he could see. He said you had begun working with a naval special warfare training program, voluntarily, in an advisory capacity, anonymous. He paused. He said you had developed a methodology for integrated tactical medicine that he believed was the most important contribution to special operations training he had seen in 20 years. His exact words. She looked at the supply case in front of her. He said you were doing it anonymously because you did not want the designation to interfere with the instruction. He said that was the correct decision. He said it was typical of you. She closed the case. He knew, she said. He knew. She was quiet. The afternoon light came through the tent fabric and lay in rectangles across the equipment. And outside the wind moved through the base and the canvas walls breathed with it. I want you to know why I did not say this sooner. Kellum continued. When you arrived, I recognized what you were, but I did not know the full picture. I knew Nolan had a daughter doing something meaningful in the training pipeline. I did not know the scale of it. I did not know you were the voice. He met her eyes, and I thought if I said something too early, it would change how you move through the situation. Nolan trusted you to work without external validation. I thought I owed him the same trust. She looked at him for a long moment. He was always 3 steps ahead, she said. Yes, he was. Tonight, she said. Tonight. Kellum agreed. He left the tent and she stayed with the afternoon light for 1 more minute. Then she went to find Beckridge. Graf came at 2200 hours. He came from below, from the south. Using the drainage system that ran beneath the valley floor, a series of cut channels and natural rock corridors that the base survey had rated non-accessible. The survey had been correct about the accessible portions. It had not been correct about all of them. 200 men emerged from 4 points along the southern perimeter simultaneously. They moved with the coordination of people who had received specific training in base assault operations and who had rehearsed this particular assault on this particular perimeter. This was not a second attempt at the same approach. This was a different plan executed by the same mind. And the different plan reflected a clear analysis of why the first had failed. The perimeter held for the first 4 minutes. Beckridge had anticipated the southern vector and positioned accordingly. The fire that met Graf's first wave was disciplined and concentrated and broke the wave against it. Then the second wave came, then the third. The coordinated pressure from 3 simultaneous directions compressed the defensive space faster than the defensive plan had accounted for, in the specific way that defensive planning can fail when the attacker has absorbed the previous engagement and made accurate corrections. Sarah was in the medical tent when the attack began, and she was at the eastern perimeter 45 seconds later, moving in the low crouch that kept her beneath the fire lines. Medical kit in her left hand, the M24 over her right shoulder. She carried both without hesitation because she had stopped treating them as contradictory somewhere in the course of the previous 18 hours. Both hands. That was what her father had said. Your hands know what they know. What you do with them is the product of everything you are. The skill is not in one hand or the other. It is in understanding when each is needed and in being willing to use both. The eastern perimeter was being held by a 12-man element with Denner running it. She reached them and immediately identified the highest priority casualty. A petty officer named Holloway with a through-and-through wound in the right thigh that had not yet been addressed. She went to work on Holloway while simultaneously assessing the tactical position. The fire from the southeast was coming from a fixed elevation 200 meters out that gave Graf's men a commanding view of the entire eastern perimeter. Denner had 2 shooters working to suppress it, but the angle was insufficient and the suppression was keeping the position occupied rather than neutralizing it. She finished Holloway. Tourniquet, packing, pressure. Denner, that elevation at 210, your angle is wrong. He glanced at her. He did not argue. He had stopped arguing with her assessment sometime during the previous night. 400 meters, moving targets. I see 2 firing positions. The left is exposed at the top of its cycle. She was already moving to a position that gave her a lateral line the other shooters could not find. Give me 60 seconds. She went flat behind a supply case, found the position in the scope, calibrated for the dark and the distance and the wind that was different at this elevation from what it had been on the open slope. The target had a cycle of exposure, 3 seconds visible, 4 seconds protected. She confirmed it across 3 cycles, and on the 4th she fired. The left position went down. She moved north along the perimeter wall 40 meters to find the angle on the right position, which had adjusted when the left went silent. Went flat, acquired, fired. The elevation went quiet. She was back at Holloway in 30 seconds, checking his pressure, adjusting the tourniquet tension, before Denner had finished processing what had just happened. He looked at her. There was nothing adequate to say. He said nothing. She was already moving to the next casualty. At 22:40, Westcott went down. He had been cleared for limited duty and placed at a secondary perimeter position that had become a primary position as the perimeter compressed. He had been holding the line, and then he was on the ground with the abrupt totality of a man whose body has reached a threshold. She reached him in 6 seconds. The tension pneumothorax that had been developing, fed by the altitude changes during the helicopter extraction and accelerated by the physical demands of the current engagement, had reached its breaking point. She read the signs by touch as much as sight. His trachea had shifted. His left chest was rigid and silent under her hand. His breathing had become something his body was fighting for rather than performing. Westcott, look at my face. He could not speak. His face had the color of someone running out of what the blood is supposed to carry. She had done this procedure before. She had done it hours ago on a different man in a different part of this valley. But the knowledge that she had done it before did not make the needle go in by itself. Each time was its own moment. Each time required the same commitment. She found the landmark by feel in the dark, her fingers reading his chest the way a blind person reads a page. She positioned the 14-gauge needle and drove it through the chest wall with the force that the procedure demanded, because the distance between adequate force and insufficient force was the distance between a lung that reinflates and a man who stops breathing. The hiss of trapped air escaping. The immediate visible change as his chest began to rise and fall in a rhythm that belonged to him again, rather than to the pressure that had been stealing it. She kept her hand on his sternum and counted his respirations and watched his color change and talked to him in the clear clinical voice. Needle is in, your lung is reinflating. Breathe slowly, slower than you want to. That is correct. He breathed. She kept her hand on his chest and felt his body pulling itself back from the edge. And she was simultaneously tracking the sound of the firefight with the other half of her attention, running both processes in parallel. The way she had been running parallel processes since the day she understood that she would always be both things at once. She heard the change. The character of the incoming fire from the western position shifted. Something had moved. Something had repositioned and found a line that had not existed 30 seconds earlier. She looked up from Westcott. Beckridge was at the western position 70 meters away, exposed at the edge of a supply structure. He had moved there to redirect an element. The correct command decision. But command decisions require presence, and presence requires exposure. And the approach to that position had been clear when he made the decision. It was not clear anymore. A figure at the far perimeter edge, 240 meters, had a direct line to where Beckridge was standing and was in the process of taking it. She calculated the time available. Approximately 3 seconds. She released Westcott. She said to the operator beside him, both hands on his chest, do not let him sit up. She was already moving, not toward Beckridge, toward the supply case 8 meters to her right. That gave her the angle. She did not go flat. No time for flat. She went to one knee behind the case. Rifle up, scope acquiring in the dark. No time for the breathing protocol. No time for the heart rate descent. No time for the window between heartbeats. She found the figure in the reticle and she squeezed. 240 meters in the time it takes a heart to complete one beat. Beckridge turned at the sound. He looked at the position. He looked back at her. She was already back on her feet, crossing to Westcott, her hand back on his chest, checking the decompression, confirming the lung was holding. Both hands, both at once, both always. Graf called the withdrawal at 23:14. The men who had been inside the perimeter watching it from the inside said something particular when they talked about it afterward. They said the withdrawal happened when something changed in the character of the pressure. When the force pressing against the base began to hesitate in a way that cascading hesitation moves through a unit, when the unit senses something it cannot fully name. The base was not behaving like a base operating at its limit. Every position that was pushed found a response that was calibrated rather than desperate. Every advance that should have opened a gap found the gap closing before it fully formed. There was an intelligence to the defense that Graf had not planned for, and at some level of operational instinct, his men could feel it. They withdrew into the dark of the mountains. Graf was captured on the third day. Beckridge was present when they brought him in. He stood across a table from a man who was 51 years old and moved with the economy of someone who had spent 12 years staying alive in conditions that did not want him alive. Graf's hands were steady. His face was unreadable. He looked at Beckridge with the expression of a man who has been waiting for some kind of accounting and is not afraid of it. Beckridge did not speak for a long time. Then he said, Syria, 2012. Yes. What happened to your team? You know what happened. I want to hear it from you. Graf looked at him for a moment. Then he talked. He talked for 40 minutes in the flat declarative language of an operator narrating a debrief. When he finished, the room was very quiet, and Beckridge sat with everything that had been said. When he stood, he did not apologize on behalf of the institution. He was not authorized to, and it would not have been adequate if he had been. But before he left, he said one thing. It should have been in the record 12 years ago. I'm going to make sure it gets there now. Graf looked at him. Something shifted in his face. Not forgiveness, not absolution. The expression of a man who has been carrying a specific weight for a long time and has just been told that someone else now knows the weight exists and intends to do something about it. That is enough, Graf said. On the evening of the 5th day, Kellam told the full room. It happened in the largest common space on the main base. Several hundred of the 480 were inside. The rest stood in the corridor outside where the words would reach them anyway, because that is how important words move through enclosed spaces. They do not stop at walls. Sarah was not there. She was in the medical bay finishing the last of her documentation. Caleb stood in the middle of the room and told them what he knew. He told them about Nolan Dunley. Not the extended biography, not the full record. The essential thing, which was what kind of man Nolan Dunley had been. What he had built across 30 years of service. What he had understood about the work. And what he had understood about the person he was leaving behind him when he was gone. He told them about a daughter who had inherited something that could not be inherited through genetics alone, but which had been transferred through years of early mornings and the specific kind of attention that a man gives to the thing he loves most. He told them about a promise and the night in a valley and a slope in the dark. And then he told them about the mentor. He told it simply in the direct declarative language that the men in that room used as their native tongue. He told them that the anonymous voice in the training protocol they had been working through for 3 years, the voice that had guided their small unit tactical medicine through scenarios that had turned out across the past 5 days, to not have been hypothetical at all, was the same woman who had been on their base for 5 days as a listed medical contractor. The voice that had been in their earpieces on the radio during the second night, steady and specific, and calibrated directing elements through a burning base with the calm of someone who had designed the emergency response before the emergency existed. That had been her, lying behind a rock with a bullet wound in her shoulder that she had packed herself one-handed. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when what has been said requires something more than cognitive processing. It requires the body to sit with it, to feel the shape of it before the mind can name it. Reed Westcott was in the third row. He had heard the voice in the training protocol 42 times across 3 years. He had never met the person it belonged to and had never tried to find out because the methodology had told him the identity did not matter. And he had believed the methodology because it was correct. He sat in the third row and listened to Kellam and thought about 42 sessions and a valley floor and a tourniquet applied in 90 seconds, and a needle in the dark and a hand on his chest, telling him to breathe slowly. He stood up. He did not say anything. He just stood. The man to his left stood. The man behind him. It moved through the room the way the best things move through groups of people who have been through something real together. Not because anyone called for it, not because anyone organized it, but because the bodies understood before the minds finished processing. In the corridor, the ones who could not see into the room but had heard what Kellam said were standing too. Denner found her the morning before she was cleared for travel. He came early in the window of a military morning, when the day is still organizing itself, and he came in the way of a man who has made a decision and is executing it before the opportunity for revision arrives. He sat beside her bed. "When you landed," he said, "I said something. I know. I made a judgment in under 30 seconds from one data point, and I stated it publicly and I repeated it. And I was wrong in every measurable way that a person can be wrong about another person." He looked at her. "I know you said I was protecting my element. I was. But I was also doing something else, which was treating a first impression as a completed assessment. That is not protecting my element. That is a bias I carry and have been wrong about before and should know better than to repeat." A pause. "I am sorry." She looked at him. "Accepted," she said. He nodded once. "Then I want to be in the first cohort." She frowned slightly. "Whatever Rear Admiral Torrance is putting together, the curriculum, the formal program, I want to be a student in the first class." He met her eyes without apology. "I am 41 years old with 12 years of operational experience, and I have spent all 12 of those years thinking about medical and tactical as two separate things. I was wrong about that for 12 years, and I want to be in the first class." She looked at him for a long moment. "I will put your name down," she said. He stood. He looked at her one more time. "Your father," he said. "Whatever he was and whatever he built the right thing." 6 months later, the dark circles under her eyes had faded. She had put back the 9 pounds she had lost across the deployment and the surgery, and the weeks of recovery that followed. Not quickly, not by effort, simply as the consequence of eating regularly and sleeping adequately and allowing the body to do what bodies do when they are no longer in emergency. Her left shoulder spoke to her in cold weather, and in the early morning before it warmed up. A low persistent ache in the repaired tissue that the surgeon had said might stay with her permanently. She had filed this in the category of things that were not problems. Data about the condition of the equipment. She ran at 5:30 every morning, 6 miles along the water. The Pacific on her left in the dark before sunrise. The salt air coming off the ocean steady and cold and clean. The lights of Coronado reflected in the surface below. The same route every morning. Her father had told her that routine was not rigidity. Routine was the structure that held everything else upright when the things around it were moving. The Integrated Combat Medicine program had completed its first cohort of 16 students and was 2 weeks into its second cohort of 22. The waiting list for the third cohort had 47 names. She called her mother on a Tuesday evening in November, sitting in her quarters with the window open and the sound of the Pacific coming through. Her mother was 63 years old and lived in the house in Denton, Texas, where Sarah had grown up, and where Nolan had kept a garden in the back acre with the same deliberate attention he brought to everything. Her mother had learned to tend the garden after he was gone, which he had said was the most surprising thing she had discovered about grief. That continuing someone's work was one of the ways you kept them present in the world. They talked for 40 minutes. Her mother asked about the shoulder, and she said it was fine, which was true. She asked about the students, and Sarah described the second cohort. The range of experience, the quality of attention, the specific satisfaction of watching an idea move through a room and produce understanding in people who would carry it into places she would never go. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I was afraid when I understood what had happened over there. I was afraid, and I was angry, and then I was afraid again." "I know." And then I thought about what your father would say. What would he say? He would say she knew what she was doing. A pause. He would say she was exactly where she needed to be. He would say I told her she would know the difference. "He did tell me," Sarah said. "I know he did, sweetheart. He told me he had." Her mother's voice had the quality of something that had been carried a long time and was being carefully set down, not discarded, just rested. "He was 3 steps ahead of everything," her mother said, "including this." "Yes." "Are you at peace with it?" Sarah looked at the open window. The sound of the ocean came through it steady and dark and continuous. "I think I am," she said. "I think I have been for a while and just needed to say it out loud." "Good," her mother said. "That is enough." That night she took the letter from the inside pocket of her jacket. She had carried it there for 5 years and 3 months. Against her ribs, against the heartbeat, against the place where the things you carry closest live. She sat at her desk and held it without opening it. She knew what was inside. She had read it enough times that the words had moved from paper to interior long ago, becoming less like external instruction and more like something structural, something that had become part of how she was built rather than something she consulted. She held it for a moment. She thought about what he had said about the promise and the thing the promise was protecting. About moments when a person of integrity has to decide which one they are actually keeping faith with. About trusting your judgment when the moment arrives. She had trusted her judgment. It had been the right judgment. She opened the desk drawer. She placed the letter inside, flat and centered, and she closed the drawer. Not away, not gone, just resting. She did not need to carry it against her heart anymore. What was in it had already become part of her, transferred from paper into the architecture of how she thought and chose and acted. She had been reading it for 5 years, and the reading had done its work, and now the work was inside her. She already was it. Monday morning, 8 o'clock, she stood at the front of the classroom, with the Pacific light coming through the windows and the sound of Coronado in November outside. 22 people in front of her, various ages, various backgrounds, various reasons for being here. What they shared was this. They had all been in places where the difference between healing and fighting had mattered completely, and they had come here to understand it better. The whiteboard behind her carried 11 words in permanent marker. Words she had written herself the night before the first cohort began standing alone in the empty classroom, thinking about her father and the valley, and the specific question of what you leave behind you that matters. She had not printed them, not typed them and formatted them and laminated them. She had written them by hand. And she had not erased them between cohorts because they were not a lesson plan item. They were the architecture beneath everything else, the structure that the rest was built on. Heal when you can, fight when you must. Know the difference. She looked at the room. Westcott was in the back row, notebook open, pen ready, paying the specific kind of attention that a person pays when they know from direct experience what the subject matter means in practice. Denner was in the third row, sitting straight and present, the posture of someone who has revised a fundamental assumption about himself and is doing the work that follows revision. She thought about her father running 6 miles at 5:30 in the morning in San Diego, about a man who had understood that the most important work is often the work that produces no documentation, no commendation, no record that anyone can find by looking. He had understood that the work that endures is the understanding you create in other people, the thing that continues to move through the world after you are no longer in the room. Not the shots you take, the understanding you leave behind. She thought about a valley and a slope in the dark and a letter pressed against her palm and a decision made in the 2 seconds before reaching for something she had promised to leave in the past. She thought about 477 men who had seen a sunrise they should not have seen, and about what that arithmetic meant, and about the specific person it had required her to be in the moment it was required. She thought about her mother's voice on the telephone, about a drawer and a desk and a letter at rest inside it after 5 years of being carried close, about what it meant to have arrived at the far side of something and still be standing. She looked at the room. 22 people who had been in hard places and were going to be in hard places again, who had come here to carry something different when they went back. She took a breath. "Let us get to work," she said, and they did.